Medicines and Vaccines Regulator. Number of things today. National Medicines and Vaccines Regulator. Number of things today. First, the TGA has approved the use of Pfizer as a COVID-19 booster for Australians 18 plus. This is an important step, and it will mean that Australia will be one of the most highly vaccinated societies in the world, one of the most recently vaccinated communities in the world, and one of the first to receive a whole-of-population booster program. In particular, and John will go in more detail to both the decision and the processes, the TGA has approved Pfizer as an 18-plus booster, and very importantly, and Professor Murphy, Professor Kelly, Professor Skerritt, ATAGI and others have been at pains to point out that this is about additional protection and that you remain fully vaccinated with 2 vaccines. The next step is that ATAGI, the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, will provide final advice. They have been working on an interim basis with the TGA, but subject to that ATAGI final advice, we intend to commence the general population booster program no later than the 8th of November. And we have the supplies, we have the distribution mechanisms. We'll just work with the states, the GPs, the pharmacies, the Commonwealth vaccination clinics and the Indigenous vaccination clinics to ensure everything's in place. And we will commence aged care and disability as a priority. This morning I had a very constructive conversation with my Victorian counterpart, the State Health Minister Martin Foley, and Victoria, which of course has the most significant current outbreak, will be looking to commence their aged care and disability support booster for those that are 6 months plus, since they've had their second dose in the imminent future. So that's very constructive, and I thank them for that. And then finally, as I say, it's a universal booster, and so it's available for people who've had Pfizer, AstraZeneca or Moderna, although it's nobody who has had a second dose of Moderna would yet qualify, as that's been more recent. But as people come to the 6-month plus time frame since their second dose, Pfizer will be available. John will set out other regulatory applications which are pending from different companies. Then in terms of international travel, the Prime Minister has indicated that I've signed off on the Biosecurity Declaration Order, which means one very simple thing. From the 1st of November, double-vaxxed Australians will be able to leave the country and return to the country. And so fully vaccinated Australians will not require an exemption to depart Australia from the 1st of November. This is the first stage of our international reopening. Subsequently, we'll have a second stage focusing on students and critical workers. We're also looking, as the Prime Minister has indicated, at early arrangements with Singapore, and then we'll look at general travel for tourism and other purposes for people entering the country. Also pleased to be able to report that overnight we've received our first shipment of Ronapreve, the combination monoclonal antibody therapy that will now be made available via the hospital process for treating patients with COVID-19. And then finally, just in terms of the rollout, another 227,000 vaccinations yesterday. We're now at over 34.8 million doses. Very significantly, we've passed the 18 million first dose mark, and we're at 87.4% of Australians 16 plus who've had a first dose. And in terms of second doses, we're at 15.4 million 16 plus and 74.8%, but just over 1 million Australians to come forward to have their second dose to achieve the 80% double vaccinated rate. So just over 1 million Australians to come forward to achieve the 80% double vaccinated rate for the national average. And then finally, the purpose of all of this is to protect the most vulnerable. Our 70-plus population now has a 98.7% first vaccination rate and over 88% second vaccination rate. I do particularly want to thank John and all of the officials at the TGA and all of the officials and advisors at ATAGI for their work. TGA, it's a marathon, not a sprint. John, just as a personal example, confessed to me this morning he hadn't been home to Victoria for 6 months. He's just been working through. And that's the sort of support we've had from our scientists and officials at the TGA, in the health department, in the other departments, and also the personal staff. You know, our personal staff work phenomenal hours. They're working, you know, until midnight last night. They're working from the earliest hours in the morning, and so, you know, it's been a great challenge as a nation, but we are immensely well served by those who are in public service. John?
Thanks, Minister. None of us joined the Health Department or the TGA expecting to have a pandemic. It's been the most challenging period, but as far as importance to the health and welfare and the future of the Australian community, probably the most important work the team has ever done. And as the Minister said, this is the result of a team effort, and no sooner does one marathon finish than another one starts. So as the Minister indicated, the TGA last night, and again I use the word last night pointedly because it is that nature of business, but after business hours. So last night the TGA made the final approval of the booster dose of a vaccine. It's for ages over 18 years. And it's over 18 years because that's the data from the clinical trials, and I'll come back and talk about the data on which the decision was made, because that's an important part of the confidence that Australians need to have and should have in the thoroughness of the regulatory process. And that means that anyone over 18 can receive a booster dose, and again, the anyone will be subject to ATAGI advice, but we are not second-guessing the ATAGI advice. The TGA advice just says over 18. At least 6 months. And again, it doesn't mean that everyone needs to front up on 6 months and 1 day. It's again at least 6 months after the completion of the COVID vaccine primary series. It's the same dose administered in the same way as the first 2 shots of Pfizer. And importantly, it was approved to go as a 3rd dose after completion of the primary course of any of the other ones. And as the Minister said, no one will be 6 months after 2 Modernas yet, but there will be people who will be at 6 months after AstraZeneca's in the coming months, and there are some people who are at 6 months after 2 Pfizer's already. The other thing that TGA did, you're aware that early this month the ATAGI recommended for people who were severely immunocompromised that they could get, it's not called a booster shot, but a 3rd shot, because their immune systems don't respond as well to the first 2 vaccines. But they could get a 3rd shot 28 days after. In reviewing the clinical evidence, that is now officially part of the product information or the official approval of a vaccine. And there's a range of immunocompromised conditions, and that includes down to 12 years old. So in that case, the children down to 12, if they're severely immunocompromised kiddies, a kid with cancer, a kid who's having chemotherapy, a kid who may have had an organ transplant, or an adult for that matter, various stem cell transplants, or on certain medicines that suppress the immune system. So there's a defined list of conditions on the Health Department's website. So down to 12, that's for the severely immunocompromised kids, and over 18 for the wider population. Now, as the Minister said, it's important to reinforce that 2 doses of each of the approved vaccines do provide excellent protection against serious illness, hospitalisation and death. And that's not just us saying it. There's now more than a dozen global studies that reinforce that. But we do know that boosters may give additional protection against mild COVID, and they may have an impact on reducing transmission. And we do know that in the elderly and people who have various shades of immunocompromise, that an additional dose is particularly valuable. And it may well provide reassurance for frontline health workers. Now, Just in terms of numbers, we're expecting that by January 1, there'll be about 1.6 million people who will be 6 months or more after their courses. And again, because of the efforts of the government, including the additional procurement from overseas, there is more than enough vaccine in the system to cover that, should the advice come from ATAGI to do that. I just wanted, before I finish, just want to touch on data. So we had the regulatory submission, which was on people between 18 and 85 years old, showing that the vaccines are well tolerated. Some people had a little bit of swelling of the lymph nodes, as you often get with various viral infections, but they went away for after a few days. There was a big study done in Israel of over 1 million people that showed, especially those over 60, their chance of becoming seriously ill and getting infected was very significantly reduced with a third dose booster, and that's in over 60s. And there was some recent results, not yet in a medical journal, but on 1,000 subjects showing that a third dose booster actually increased vaccine efficacy to 96%. Now, I just want to finish by foreshadowing a few things. As I said, the staff have gone into the showers after a marathon, and I'm asking them to go back out onto the running track first thing in the morning. And we, coincidentally, yesterday we received not the full application, but most of it, but we still have more to get from the Pfizer application for 5 to 11-year-olds. And we will look at that carefully. Some of you may be aware that overnight, in fact, I think 7 a.m. this morning, the announcement was made. I did have a staff member who was on that committee meeting all night. I hope he's in bed now. But the FDA announced that their advisory committee had endorsed, with no votes, the application from Pfizer, 5 to 11-year-old. That works through their system. It involves FDA making a decision and then the US Centres for Disease Control and Protection making a decision. We also are working with other companies such as Moderna on potential boosters. Moderna have also indicated that they have assembled data on younger age groups as well. And of course, Novavax have announced publicly that in the next fortnight they expect to complete the submission of data to major regulators, and that may well include Australia. And finally, those of you will also have seen that we believe the November 1 launch date for the rapid antigen tests will be maintained. Major supermarket chains and convenience stores have announced that they will have stock available from that date. We've approved 9 rapid antigen tests to date, and we have another few in advanced stages of review, working with the companies just to finalise things such as the instructions for using them. Thanks very much.
I'll start with Rachel and then work across.
Thanks, Minister. Firstly, you said that the general population rollout for boosters is likely to start on November 8, but aged care and disability sector will be prioritised. Given ATAGI's meeting today, could that rollout for those aged care residents start as soon as tomorrow? And secondly, how will the booster shot be recorded on our vaccination certificate? Will be required?
I won't preempt ATAGI's advice, but they have worked very closely with the TGA, and so I'm quietly hopeful, but subject to their advice, November the 8th for the general population. For aged care and disability, we already have sufficient support from ATAGI on the basis of their preliminary advice for that to commence. So that program, Victoria, is looking to commence it immediately. Those that wish to provide self-vaccination, so there are a number of facilities and providers that do that. One example I've given previously is TLC. They are probably one of the leading providers with regards to self-vaccination. They're all preparing to do it. They do have to get consent from their residents or their residents' carers, and so that process will determine it. But subject to the consent process in aged care and those disability residents who had early vaccinations, they're free to proceed, and we're facilitating the arrangement of those. Second question, apologies.
It was on how will our booster dose be recorded? Will it be part of our vaccination certificate, and will that be required for travel?
No, it's not a required element. You are fully vaccinated at this point in time, and then it will be added to the immunisation register, as is the ordinary course of events. At the moment, your flu vaccine, your Children's National Immunisation Program vaccinations, and your doses as they arrive, and so that will be recorded on your immunisation register. Claire?
Do we have any idea idea of in what settings the rapid antigen tests will be allowed? Have states indicated will they be able to replace if you go into quarantine or be used to enter their borders? And also, Minister, just on the booster, the original vaccine also wasn't initially compulsory, but over time certain professions were added to that list. Could that be the case for the booster?
So I'll speak very briefly on boosters and then turn to John on rapid antigen tests. So at this stage there's no plan or intention, and again the Commonwealth has not been mandating other than in the aged care staff setting, where at the moment we're at 99.8%, and I want to thank all of those staff participating in that. And again, we'll always follow the medical advice. So I'll leave that to individual states or territories, but the clear advice and the preliminary ATAGI advice, the advice from SciTag, Professor Brendan Murphy's team, as well as the TGOs, you are fully vaccinated, but the booster is, as John has set out, just that. It adds to protection. John?
On the rapid antigen tests, firstly, there's no constraints as to where they can be sold, including online, convenience stores, petrol stations, anywhere. There are a few rules around the advertising of those tests. They can be advertised, but for example, they can't say our test is better than their test. So there are controls, and that's usual for medicines and medical devices at comparative advertising and claiming. Also, for example, they can't claim to be diagnostic, because it is a screening test, and people who test positive should go and have a PCR gold standard test. As far as the states and territories are concerned, they're working out their own policies for rollout of those tests. For example, New South Wales Education has said they're going to mainly target them for outbreak control rather than testing every school child. But now the tests are here, and some of the states and territories have indicated they'll procure as well as the market. They will make decisions on how they roll out those tests.
Minister, on the logistics of this, will there be reminder messages sent out to people that your 6 months has now passed, or is it incumbent on you to do it? And Professor Skerritt, can I ask you, is this 3 shots and you're done, or are we going to be getting every 6 months you'll have to get another booster shot?
Do you want to start with that one, John?
Yeah, unfortunately I wasn't issued with a crystal ball when I got this job. Now, with other vaccines, and again, we don't have that experience with messenger RNA vaccines, so I don't want to necessarily make a comparison. There are some vaccines whereby 3 shots gives you almost lifelong protection. So, as I said when the vaccine was initially approved, when I stood up with the Minister and the Prime Minister, seems like a lifetime ago, but it was only in January, February, we didn't know about the duration of protection. And so no one knows about the duration of protection post this booster. The really good news is that a few months ago we were worried that we'd have to have quite different vaccines because of the emergence of variants. And even with the severity of Delta and how predominant Delta has been globally, we haven't needed to change the booster. So unfortunately the answer is we'll have to wait and see.
And on the logistics?
So right now what happens is that obviously it continues to roll out in exactly the same way. We have the booster program is ready to go. We just now will work with the states and territories and with the GPs, and so it's just continuing on. Tom?
Thanks, Minister. Professor Skerritt, what do you think the timeline will be using the FDA as an indication for kids' approval in Australia? Is it weeks away?
Well, we've got an incomplete application. It's not in the full final format, so it's not a legally binding application yet. So, and this is quite normal. The drug companies do test the waters with FDA before they even go to Europe, never mind Australia. So we're expecting to get a full application in the coming week or two. As I've said, our team's got out of the shower and have started to look at this, having finished the boosters literally at 6 o'clock last night. It will depend on quality of data. They're only just starting to look at it because they only got the data. So it will take a few weeks, but I would hope that we would get there by the end of November. But it really does depend when we get the full application from Pfizer, a complete version, and if there's any issues. We also have to remember that FDA has not approved it yet. Their committee recommendation is made public. They have to look at it, and then the Centres for Disease Control have to look at it in early November.
Professor.
Minister, so we're heading towards 80% of the population being double dosed. Is there a target as to how many of that you expect to get a booster shot? Are there any estimates set? And also, given that the booster shots will be rolled out first to aged care disability, given that there were issues getting them into those settings for the first vaccine rollout, what sort of lessons have been learned from that to make sure that there isn't any sort of delays in terms of supply or getting numbers up when the boosters are starting?
Sure. So the first thing is we don't want to put any limits on the number of people to have first doses, second doses or booster shots. And we want to encourage every Australian that is eligible to continue to come forwards to complete their primary course, and when they are due 6 months plus to come forward for their boosters. So we don't want to put any limits on that. We want to encourage every eligible Australian to do so. Then I think that's the critical thing there. In terms of aged care, we went through. We were able to make sure everybody was vaccinated. The principal challenge was supply. We have full supply, and we're already in preparation and planning to roll out. This time, there's only one shot that's required, and there is a sort of an unconstrained supply. So that's important, and it follows the 6 months plus, and we're in a very strong situation. Thanks for your patience.
Professor Skerritt, just on mixing and matching, the messaging until now has been don't mix and match. Now you're saying if you've had AZ, you can get Pfizer. So can you just run through why that's okay? And just secondly as well, with pregnancy, Pfizer has been approved and it's safe for women that are pregnant. Is it still the same with the booster shot? And to you, Minister Hunt, you've said you expect population-wide, so age 18 and up. In the US and UK, they've got specific groups. It's not population-wide. So why is it going to be different here? And also one more, sorry, from Melbourne, on the tennis. I know everyone wants to know about the tennis stars. Are you comfortable with unvaccinated tennis stars coming to Australia if they complete 2 weeks of quarantine?
Okay, so I'll let John go first, and then you got a lot of value for your money in that.
So you asked about pregnancy, and there's been a number of studies now published on pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes. I think it's about 5 or so now. And it's usual, but as every week goes by, there's probably 10 papers published in top-shelf medical journals on these vaccines. And so our body of knowledge increases. So those 5 studies have shown that there's no impact on pregnancies with these vaccines, and they're recommended for use. And so there's no evidence to suggest that a booster should be any different there. So it won't be, to use a medical word, contraindicated in pregnancy. On mix and match, we were cautious, again, back in, I think I was asked at estimates in June, and we were cautious because there'd only been 1 or 2 studies and very little clinical observation. Again, there's probably now dozens of studies to show that actually mixing and matching, so for example 2 AstraZenecas and then a Pfizer, or even 1 AstraZeneca and a Pfizer, actually gives a really good immune response. And so regulators worldwide in almost November, the end of October, are a lot more confident about the value of mix and match than we were in May or June.
So in terms of whole of population, that's the approval. And we've followed the advice on the approval. Obviously, we'll await the final advice from ATAGI, but they've been working very closely with the TGA throughout, and there's a lot of engagement there. So, subject to the ATAGI advice, we're ready to proceed. Israel has commenced that. I know other countries considering and moving towards. I'm not aware of any other country that has commenced, but I remain to be corrected on that. But certainly we know that Israel has commenced. What that would mean is that Australia would be one of the first countries in the world to commence a whole-of-population booster program. So we would have one of the highest vaccination rates, one of the most recently vaccinated populations, and one of the first booster programs, which means that we will be one of the most protected countries in the world. In terms of the tennis, pretty simple position, and that is you can come in if you're double vaccinated. if a state is seeking an exemption for somebody to come in for a workplace program or a similar event and they are unvaccinated, they can come in if that state seeks it, and they are subject, however, to the 2 weeks quarantine, and that's without fear or favour. And so then it's entirely a matter for the state or the state working with Tennis Australia. And if there's a no jab, no play policy in Victoria, that's a matter for them to resolve. So you have to do quarantine if you haven't been vaccinated. If the state wishes to seek the exemption for the players, not any one particular player, then that would be granted at the Commonwealth level on a major events basis, but it would require the full vaccination. Jade, and then Sarah.
Will you make any changes to allow pharmacies to administer their Pfizer as a booster shot? And also a question for Professor Skerritt. Will the process for assessing Pfizer for children be any different to the process for assessing Pfizer in adults?
So the answer is yes. We will be making Pfizer available to pharmacies, and we will be making Moderna available to those GPs that wish to put it in place, particularly in some rural areas or more remote areas. There's an interest in Moderna for GPs, but precisely because at this stage there hasn't been an application and an approval for Moderna as a booster for the pharmacies that are operating the programs, we want to make sure that that's available. John,
on the process for Pfizer, as soon as any medicine or vaccine is proposed for use or applied for use in children, you obviously need to dig even deeper, and I'm saying even because we look at safety very thoroughly for every age group, but we dig in even deeper for children. And so the trial data for the children will be on more kids than, say, on the booster. The safety monitoring has been for a longer period of time. We're not seeing any red flags there, I should say, but it's very early days yet. But yes, and the other thing is that the application, again, this is public knowledge, for the children is for a third of a dose, because I believe once you're under 11, a third of a dose is just as good as, so it's 10 micrograms rather than 30 micrograms. So in that way, the process for the kids is different, but the nature of the data is the same. And so far it looks okay, but as I've said, we've only had it for a day.
Just on kids now, 5 to 11 possibly being vaccinated, do you ever see a situation where it will be no jab, no play? We've got that for other vaccinations for children now. They're going to be able to get a COVID jab. How do you see that evolving?
Sure. So no plans or expectations at this point in time, and I think that's likely to remain the case.
Given that international travel is opening up, will there be a point in time in the future where people will need their booster to travel overseas and return from overseas? And a second, if I may, we're obviously moving on to boosters, but the UN has said that developed countries should prioritise helping vaccinate poorer countries. Has there been any update on vaccinating our Pacific neighbours?
Sure. Well, let me start with the Pacific. We're committed to 60 million vaccines as well as $500 million of funding on that front. The AstraZeneca was done with the capacity to vaccinate the whole of the Australian population twice, and we always knew that if we had spare of vaccines, we would be able to share them. And Fiji has been, as an example, very significantly vaccinated with Australian-made, CSL-produced AstraZeneca vaccine, and so we'll continue to supply. We're going to make sure we complete that contract, even though we've been supplied with all we need for Australia to meet our first and second doses with AstraZeneca. Part of our duty to the region is to continue to provide that, and we're engaged literally every day through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade with regional countries.
I'd just add, Minister, it's not just the supply, although obviously the supply is central. We're also very actively involved technically in helping those countries work out how to administer the vaccines, how to store them, how to report safety issues, and also looking at a broader range of vaccines. And I actually have a team of people funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade that is providing technical support underpinning these tens of millions of doses that we're providing in the region.
So just in terms of international travel and boosters, again, at this point in time. And as we've said throughout the pandemic, we have to review everything as it progresses and as the science evolves. But the advice we have is you remain fully vaccinated with the 2 vaccines, and we'll continue to follow the international science, but that's the requirement for international travel.
Thanks, Minister. Just moving away from vaccines for a moment, if I can. Health groups, both national and international, are calling for more ambitious climate targets to protect Australians' health, saying they want to see health explicitly outlined in our climate commitments. Does Australia's emissions reduction plan do enough to address the health risks associated with climate change? And how much was health involved in developing that plan?
So the answer is, in my view, yes. It is a very important consideration, and it was well considered. I was deeply engaged. The Department of Health was engaged. I was involved not just as a Cabinet Minister, but through the preliminary discussions. Obviously, I have the current hat, but I had a previous hat, having helped develop and lead Australia's position for the previous previous international pledging conference, the Paris conference. So health was deeply engaged, and I'm very thankful to the Prime Minister and to Angus Taylor, the Minister for Emissions Reduction and Energy, for that, as well as industry. Look, let me give you my personal view on this. This is a very significant moment in Australia, and it's a significant moment for a number of reasons. One is it builds on what we did in Paris. In Paris, and some of you will have been in this room in 2015 when we announced it with then Prime Minister Tony Abbott and with Julie Bishop. And to go from -5 to -26 to -28 was a major step. And many doubted that we'd be able to achieve 2020's Kyoto 2 target, let alone the Paris target. We've roared past 2020, and we did that without an electricity tax. We're going to clearly meet and significantly beat our 2030 targets with the revised projections. And now we've committed to net zero, and we were cautious in doing that because we didn't want to make a pledge which would either damage jobs or drive up electricity prices. But once we were able to see that pathway, Angus followed that same careful process of having worked it through. And so I'm really proud of the next evolution. I think it's good for health. I think it protects jobs. And I think it's a great thing that Australia's playing this leading role. The other thing I'd mention, when you think of it as India over 80% increase since 2005, China over 70% increase, South Korea over 30% increase, Canada is a -1% decrease since 2005, New Zealand -4%, you have Japan and the US about 7 and 13, I believe, I stand to be corrected, and then Australia and the EU are at -20.8 and -21. So we're almost identical in our reductions to the EU. We are right at the global forefront of reducing emissions. Josh, to finish. Sorry, I've been waiting my chance to say on that.
Thanks, Vince.
Just 2 quick ones. One on the rapid tests. Will they only be available for purchase, or will they be available for free at some point, like in the UK? And if not, why not? And I guess one on the boosters as well. As you've both said, after 2 doses you're fully vaccinated. I think some people might ask, what's the point then of getting a third one? Is it just a peace of mind sort of thing, or will there be, I guess, at some point your full vaccination status kind of expires or runs out or something?
Sure. Do you want to go to the point of
I'll
boosters?
do the booster one if you want to do a rapid test one, Minister. So while we've emphasised that 2 vaccinations is considered fully vaccinated, whether it be for entry to domestic venues or for international travel, there's no doubt that there is some waning, albeit slower than perhaps some of the pundits have called it. There is some waning of the immune response, especially in people over 60, especially with those who have immunocompromises. And so in those populations in particular, but again, if someone in the general population may 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months later, they're getting a booster to just give them absolute coverage, not only against serious illness, but also against mild illness and transmission. And those 2 things while not life-threatening, are very important for the economy and for returning to pre-COVID life.
So the trick to the booster's in the name. It's a booster. It's an Olympic year. Sidious, Altius, Fortius. Faster, higher, stronger. It's additional protection over and above. Sorry, I've really taken to freelancing now. But the booster is all about the name. It's perfectly titled. Extra protection. In terms of rapid antigen testing, so the critical thing here is that currently we have trials which are underway where we've been providing support in aged care, and we have supplies which have been made available to certain critical user groups through the National Medical Stockpile. But we're making it generally available, and we'll let that market develop, and for those that have got the critical needs, we've been able to provide them. It's not a replacement for the PCR, as John has been at pains to rightly point out. It's an additional support and an additional screening tool rather than a pure diagnostic tool. So they do serve those two different purposes. I'll just finish with saying another important milestone today in terms of Australia's vaccination program. And the boosters will mean that we will be one of the most highly vaccinated societies, one of the most recently vaccinated societies, and as a consequence, one of the best protected societies in the world. Take care, everybody. Thank you.